these are quite interesting events, these sorts of things, because you have an image in your mind, probably, of what each of us represents and what we're going to say, and there's a whole load of supporting bollocks that comes behind me. And I'm just going to very quickly put it into context. I've served in the military for 40 years, so now I look completely like Captain Mannering in your mind. I did 22 different jobs in that time, which is far too many if you think about continuity, but it produced an extraordinary amount of variety. Those jobs varied from the sort of thing that Kate's been talking about, where you're effectively putting the widgets into the machine with a bunch of other people and you're making sure that they do it properly, to, in the middle of my career, I found myself as the sort of strategic advisor to the President of Sierra Leone when he was trying to deal with the Revolutionary United Front. I ended up in Afghanistan as the deputy to McChrystal and Petraeus at the sort of strategic international level, and then effectively the chief operating officer of the army, and responsible for the military reaction to the Olympics. Now, I'm not sort of blowing smoke up myself. I'm just trying to give you a sense of what I represent when I start to speak. I'm going to try and reflect the breadth of that experience in the three principal points that I'm going to make. And I'm making them partly to provoke and partly to try to stimulate the way you're thinking. The only other caveat, there is probably more experience in this room than I have myself. That if you were to chunk up all the experience that exists in the different parts, the different sectors that you are in, there's a heck of a lot of experience here. So be very wary of anything that I say and apply your own mirror to it to make sure that you're putting it in the right context. Okay, three big handful points. Military term of situational understanding, situational awareness. A gripe I have about inputs and outputs, and then a comment on leadership, and I have never read a theoretical book on leadership. So it's entirely based on personal experience and therefore dead suspect. Situational understanding is the code in the military for knowing what's going on. You would all think that it was an absolute prerequisite for anybody who's doing anything, but funnily enough, the most important person who stands beside you as a military leader in the past has been the person who fires your guns or the engineer who makes sure that you can break through the minefield, not the chief information officer. Now, I would contend that in the last third of my career, the most important person that I needed to speak to was the person who understood what was going on, who was managing the information and making the immediate deductions from it. And what they were getting was a mass of information from different places, and they were, I'm afraid, processing it in a Victorian, paper-driven, hierarchical manner. So the information tended to come to me a bit late, and having been put through layers of hierarchy, who had all tried to add their value so that I was able to make the right decision. I would now contend that you need to know really early on what's going on if you're going to make the senior leadership decisions that you need to. That you then push out the information to some people to conduct some analysis with your scope, with your take on it, and then you watch what's going on the whole time so you can react if you need to. Because the world doesn't wait any longer in that rather nice progressive way that it used to. You have to be able to react in time to seize an opportunity, or, in our case, to avoid getting outmaneuvered. So if we didn't manage information differently, we would be outmaneuvered. Now the challenge is there is still a need for hierarchy. So information sees no hierarchy, but there is still a need for hierarchy. If you just allow anarchy with one leader, a very flat structure to operate, you lose, in a military context, two critical things. You lose the understanding of the plan. Everybody can't understand the whole plan. You have to drive it down into component parts so that individuals will understand their part in it. And secondly, in the military, there's a geographical aspect to it. If I'm in charge of a group of 30 men, I can affect that area that may be 10 miles around me, but I can't affect the area that's 100 miles around me. There is somebody above me who needs to understand that. So applying hierarchy in a conceptual and a geographical way in an open information environment was the biggest challenge that I think I left as a senior leader in the military. So that's point one. Inputs and outputs. I was massively frustrated by the institutional fixation with inputs when I left the Ministry of Defence. There was a major correction required. The budget was out of control. They had to cut the budget. That's the time to innovate. When you innovate, you need to look at the output in order to work out what things you can do differently and then feed that back into your input structure. That is not the way that a large institution like the Ministry of Defence works. I'm sure that's not replicated by any of the organisations that you work for. But I had a huge frustration that the people that I was briefing as the Chief Operating Officer couldn't get their minds off the inputs, and they didn't seem to understand what the blokes were doing, what the actual outcomes were. Now, there will be people here who've done the most amazing things to supply chains, absolutely necessary to make sure you're efficient as possible. But what's the point in a really efficient supply chain if when it arrives at the point of production, it doesn't do what it's really required to do? And I have, because of where I come from, because of my background, an absolute passion for making sure that the output is really what is required. And I think that that's more important. And I would challenge the Chief Executive, when I was the Chief Operating Officer in the Army, I would challenge him, because it would be a him, because that's the way the Army's structured at the moment, that he needed to listen more to what I was saying and less to the stuff that was being whispered in his ear about inputs. And I think if one can change that culture in an institution, and it's probably the bigger institutions, although not exclusively, that's a really good thing to enable your leaders, because your leaders very often are people who are affecting outputs. My third point is about leadership. And as I say, I've never really read a book on it. But by God, I know it makes a difference. And it's a sort of obvious statement to make, but you know in the military when you encounter a unit, an organisation that's being well led, and you know when you arrive at a unit that's not being well led, and it sounds silly this, but you can just sort of sense it. But how many people at the top of the structures, the organisations that we're in, never get their backsides out to meet the people who are doing the leading in order to know what's going on? And I think a lot of people at the higher levels of organisations are actually frightened of going out and seeing the people who are doing the business. I think they somehow feel, and it's probably easier if in the military because you've been there and you can come out with some completely bollocks war story about something that you pretended you did. So, but you know, you can say to them that you've been there. If you're in an organisation where you've come in as a senior or a middle-ranking executive, and the guy who's actually whacking the widget into the thing, it feels a bit detached from you, as does their leader element. I think that's a mistake. I think you have to get out there to sense what those people are doing in order to make a judgment about whether their leadership is effective, agile or whatever. So, and one other point on leadership, and Kate's mentioned it already, you've got to ensure that you empower those people to do things that are right. And something she said struck me, and I'm it'll feel a bit specific, but I'm going to make it because it's a good example. She is challenged by some bloke who turns around and says something to her when she's making operational decisions that questions her effectiveness. There is an institutional issue there that needs to be addressed by people way above the level that she's at, because that is a serious flaw in the culture that's going on in the organisation. How do we know that that's going on? Only if you're getting down there and talking to people and spotting as it comes. So leadership, in my view, is about judging when you need to interface with the people who are working for you and absolutely understanding that the output of what you're doing is fundamental to its ultimate success. Thank you very much.